a frozen highway, a muffled cry in the dead of winter. When Rebecca found a newborn buried in a snowdrift, her only thought was keeping him alive, but the moment his tiny, ice-cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, her veins ignited. A jagged obsidian crest burned itself into her skin, the ancient seal of a king who had been hunting for his heir for over 4 centuries, and now by saving the child, she had just become his property. The blizzard had swallowed State Highway 145 whole, turning the winding mountain pass of the San Juan National Forest into a claustrophobic tunnel of swirling white. Rebecca Hayes, a 28-year-old neonatal nurse, gripped the steering wheel of her Subaru Outback until her knuckles turned translucent. She was exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep and 3 cups of awful cafeteria coffee after pulling a brutal double shift at the Telluride Regional Medical Center. The heater blasted against her shins, but the damp, bone-deep cold of the Colorado winter still seeped through the floorboards. The radio was nothing but a wall of thick abrasive static. The weather service had called it a bomb cyclone, warning everyone to stay off the roads. Rebecca had almost made it to the safety of her cabin when her headlights swept across a jarring splash of color in the monotonous sea of white, red, deep, impossible crimson. Rebecca slammed on the brakes. The anti-lock system violently stuttered tires fishtailing across the black ice before the car jerked to a halt inches from a snowbank. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She peered through the snow-caked windshield, her breath fogging the glass. Just off the shoulder, partially buried beneath a fresh drift of powder, was a bundle of velvet fabric. It wasn't a jacket or a lost scarf. It was shaped like a bassinet. No, she thought, the medical professional in her instantly overriding her fatigue. No, please don't let it be. Rebecca shoved her door open. The wind howled a physical force that nearly knocked her backward. She waded into the knee-deep snow, her boots crunching loudly in the eerie silence of the isolated mountain road. The temperature was easily 10 below zero. If there was a living creature in that bundle, its odds of survival were dropping by the second. As she reached the crimson velvet, she noticed the material. It was unnaturally thick, woven with an intricate shimmering gold thread that looked distinctly antique, completely out of place in the rugged Colorado wilderness. Rebecca fell to her knees in the snow, her bare hands trembling as she pulled back the heavy folds. A face looked back at her. Rebecca gasped, a plume of white vapor escaping her lips. It was a baby boy, perhaps no more than 3 months old. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shivering. He was perfectly still, staring up at her, with eyes the color of a stormy, bruised sky, a piercing, unnatural silver gray that seemed to catch the harsh glare of her headlights. His skin was the color of alabaster, flawless and terrifyingly pale. "Oh God, sweetheart, I've got you," Rebecca whispered, her voice cracking. Her NICU training kicked in. Hypothermia in infants this small was usually fatal within minutes. She expected cyanosis, the bluish tint of oxygen-starved lips and extremities. She expected the faint, shallow gasping of a failing respiratory system. But the child simply watched her, his gaze holding an intensity that felt far too old for an infant. Rebecca reached down to scoop him up. She slid her left hand beneath the nape of his neck to support his head, and her right hand over his small chest. The moment her bare skin made contact with him, a shockwave of static electricity snapped through the frigid air. It was so violent it sounded like a firecracker. Before Rebecca could flinch, the baby's tiny left arm shot out from the velvet folds. His small fingers, possessing a strength that defied biology, clamped around Rebecca's right wrist. "Ah!" Rebecca cried out, trying to pull back, but the infant's grip was like a steel vise. Then came the heat. It started at the exact point of his touch, an agonizing, localized inferno that felt as though someone had pressed a white-hot branding iron directly against her pulse point. Rebecca screamed, the sound tearing from her throat and getting lost in the roaring wind. She fell back into the snow, but the baby held on his tiny body, rising with her arm. Through the blur of tears and searing pain, Rebecca watched in absolute horror as the veins in her wrist began to bulge and darken, but they weren't turning blue or purple. They were turning pitch black. The blackness seeped from beneath the baby's fingers, crawling just under the surface of her skin like living ink. It moved with a terrifying sentience, weaving and branching out, knitting itself into a precise geometric pattern. The smell of burning flesh and ozone filled the icy air. Rebecca sobbed, her vision swimming with black spots. "Let go, please!" She choked out, her medical training entirely useless in the face of this impossible agony. As quickly as the pain had peaked, it vanished, leaving behind a numbing, heavy throb. The baby finally released his grip, his small hand dropping back onto the velvet. He let out a soft, contented coo, his silver eyes completely calm. Rebecca scrambled backward, clutching her wrist against her chest. She was hyperventilating, the freezing air burning her lungs. Trembling violently, she angled her arm toward the beam of the headlights. There, permanently seared into the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a mark. It wasn't a burn scar. It was a perfect, intricate tattoo, the color of fresh obsidian. It depicted a crescent moon entirely pierced through the center by a dual-bladed dagger wrapped in a crown of thorns. It looked ancient, flawless, and terrifyingly permanent. A fresh wave of adrenaline hit her. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know if she had been exposed to some bizarre chemical or if the exhaustion was finally inducing hallucinations. But the baby was still in the snow, and despite whatever nightmare had just scarred her arm, she could not leave a child to freeze to death. Gritting her teeth, Rebecca bundled the infant tightly in the velvet, scooped him up, and sprinted back to the running Subaru. She threw him into the passenger seat, cranked the heater to its absolute maximum, and slammed the car into drive. She was going back to Telluride Regional. The fluorescent lights of the Telluride Regional Medical Center's emergency department flickered slightly as Rebecca burst through the double doors, clutching the velvet bundle to her chest. The waiting room was empty, a testament to the severity of the blizzard outside. "I need help! I need a doctor right now!" Rebecca shouted, her voice echoing off the linoleum floors. Nurse Sarah Jenkins, a veteran of the ER who had worked with Rebecca for 3 years, rushed out from behind the triage desk. "Rebecca, what are you doing back here? What is that?" "I found him on 145. He was buried in the snow." Rebecca panted, her heart still threatening to crack her ribs. She laid the baby gently on the nearest gurney. "Get Dr. Fisher. I need pediatric warmers, full vitals, and a heated saline IV ready." Sarah didn't ask questions. She hit the trauma button on the wall and began stripping away the heavy velvet blanket. Dr. Gregory Fisher, a stern man in his late 50s, jogged out of the trauma bay, a stethoscope slung around his neck. "What do we have?" Fisher asked, clicking on a pen light. "Male infant found in a snowdrift. Unresponsive to environmental stimuli, but breathing. He feels ice cold, Greg. We need to core temp him immediately," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. She kept her right arm tucked against her side, the sleeve of her scrubs pulled tightly down. Her wrist was throbbing in time with her heartbeat, a dull rhythmic ache that felt deeply invasive. Dr. Fisher leaned over the baby. He checked the pupils, which reacted perfectly to the light. The baby stared back at him with those unsettling silver eyes. "He's alert," Fisher muttered, clearly baffled. "Skin color is pale, but no signs of severe frostbite or tissue necrosis. Let's get a temperature." Sarah gently inserted the digital thermometer. A few seconds later, the machine let out a sharp beep. Sarah frowned, tapping the screen. "That can't be right." "What is it?" Rebecca asked. "It says 62 degrees Fahrenheit," Sarah said, looking up at Dr. Fisher. "At 62 degrees, his heart should be in profound ventricular fibrillation or completely stopped. He should be dead." "Machine's broken. The cold must have messed with the sensors. Use the tympanic scanner," Fisher ordered, pulling out his stethoscope and pressing it to the baby's chest. For a long moment, Fisher was completely silent. The harsh fluorescent light cast deep shadows under his eyes. Slowly, he lowered the stethoscope. "Greg," Rebecca pressed. "What's his heart rate?" "Oh, 35 beats per minute," Fisher whispered, his medical composure fracturing. "It's a slow, rhythmic, heavy beat, not an infant's heartbeat. It sounds like an adult marathon runner resting. This is biologically impossible." "Rebecca, are you sure he was in the snow? I dug him out myself." Rebecca snapped, her stress peaking. "Check his blood work. We need a panel." Sarah approached with a tiny needle to draw from the baby's heel. As the needle pierced the skin, the baby didn't cry. He didn't even flinch. A single drop of blood welled up. Rebecca stared at it. It wasn't the bright, oxygen-rich red of a healthy infant. It was a dark, mesmerizing burgundy, so thick it almost looked like syrup. "I'm calling Child Services and the Sheriff's Department," Dr. Fisher said, stepping back from the gurney. as if the child had suddenly become a bomb. "Keep him in the warmer, but don't administer any fluids until we know what we are dealing with here." While Sarah attended to the child, Rebecca backed away, stumbling into the staff restroom down the hall. She locked the door, leaning heavily against the sink. She felt nauseous. The hospital, her sanctuary of science and logic, suddenly felt alien. With trembling fingers, she rolled up her right sleeve. The mark was still there. The crescent moon, the dagger, the thorns. Under the bright bathroom vanity lights, she could see that it wasn't just ink on skin. The black lines seemed to catch the light, holding a faint, unnatural iridescence. As she watched, horrified, the mark pulsed. A faint, glowing red line traveled through the dagger design, perfectly synchronized with the beating of her own heart. "I'm infected with something," she thought, panic rising like bile, a parasite, a bioweapon. A heavy knock on the emergency room doors echoed down the hall, jarring her from her thoughts. Rebecca quickly pulled her sleeve down and exited the restroom. Deputy Miller, the local sheriff's deputy, had arrived covered in snow. He was talking to Dr. Fisher at the front desk. "Doc, I checked the state and federal databases. Amber alerts, missing persons, hospital abductions. Nothing. Nobody is missing a kid within 500 miles. Before Fisher could reply, the heavy glass doors of the emergency room slid open again. The storm outside howled, blowing a dusting of snow into the lobby. 3 men walked in. They did not look like local law enforcement. They did not look like distraught parents. They were dressed in immaculate, tailored charcoal suits that looked entirely inadequate for a blizzard, yet none of them shivered. The man leading the trio was tall, with sharp, predatory features and slicked-back dark hair. He possessed an aura of quiet, overwhelming authority that instantly silenced the room. Deputy Miller rested a hand on his duty belt. "Can I help you, gentlemen? The ER is strictly for patients right now." The lead man reached into his breast pocket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He produced a thick leather folder and placed it on the triage counter. "My name is Alistair Reed," the man said. His voice was smooth, carrying a faint, untraceable European accent. "I represent the Croft Corporation, specifically the private interests of its CEO. We are here to retrieve the child." Dr. Fisher stepped forward, crossing his arms. "Retrieve, I don't care who you represent, Mr. Reed. This child is a John Doe. He's in ward of the state right now. You can't just walk into a hospital and claim him." Alistair smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. "The child's name is Noah Croft. He was abducted from a private medical facility in Geneva 3 days ago. The documents in that folder include a federal court mandate, full DNA profiling, and a signature from a United States federal judge granting us immediate, uncontested custody. Now, where is the boy?" Rebecca, standing near the trauma bay doors, felt a sudden sharp ache in her wrist. The mark was burning again. It wasn't the agonizing fire from the highway, but a deep territorial pull. She looked toward the trauma bay. The baby was staring directly at the door, his silver eyes fixed on the corridor where Alistair stood. "I need to verify these documents," Deputy Miller said, his voice lacking its usual authority. He pulled the folder toward him, his eyes scanning the heavily sealed paperwork. "Even with a judge's signature, protocol dictates we wait for a child services representative to facilitate the transfer." Alistair Reed stepped closer to the glass partition. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "There is no protocol, Deputy. Not for us. The child requires specific, immediate medical attention that your rural clinic cannot provide. Every second you delay is a liability you cannot afford." "His vitals are stable despite the abnormalities," Dr. Fisher argued, stepping between Alistair and the trauma bay hallway. "I am the attending physician. I will not release an infant into a blizzard to corporate lawyers without a medical transport team." "We are the transport team," Alistair said softly. He glanced over Dr. Fisher's shoulder and locked eyes with Rebecca. His gaze was analytical, dissecting her in a fraction of a second. "You are the one who found him." It wasn't a question. Rebecca swallowed hard, stepping protectively in front of the trauma bay doors. "I did, and until child services arrives, he stays right here." Alistair sighed, a sound of profound impatience. He nodded to the 2 large men flanking him. They moved forward with alarming speed, easily brushing past Deputy Miller, whose hand flew to his radio. "Hey, back off!" Miller shouted. Before the deputies could draw their weapons, Alistair raised a hand. "Enough! The master is here." The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The ambient noise, the humming of the refrigerators, the distant beep of monitors seemed to mute itself. The double doors to the ER slid open once more. A man walked into the hospital, If Alistair Reed was intimidating, this man was a natural disaster wrapped in human flesh. He wore a long cashmere overcoat darker than a starless night. He appeared to be in his early 30s, possessing a brutal, sculpted beauty that belonged on an ancient coin rather than a modern businessman. His eyes were the exact same piercing, bruised silver grey as the child's. This was Valerian Croft. He didn't look at the doctors, he didn't look at the police. He walked with absolute, undisputed ownership of the space he occupied. He stopped in the center of the room, bringing a paralyzing chill with him. The frost on the windows actually began to creep inward, spiderwebbing across the glass. "Where is my son?" Valerian's voice was a low rumble, rich and commanding, vibrating in Rebecca's chest. Dr. Fisher opened his mouth to speak, but Valerian simply raised a single finger. Fisher choked his hands, flying to his throat as if an invisible vice had just clamped around his windpipe. He stumbled back, gasping for air. "Hey!" Rebecca screamed, her fear eclipsed by fury. "Stop it! Whatever you're doing, stop it!" Valerian's terrifying gaze slowly shifted to Rebecca. For a moment his expression was completely unreadable. Then he took a step toward her. As he closed the distance, the mark on Rebecca's wrist flared with blinding intensity. She gasped, grabbing her arm, as the obsidian lines burned through her scrubs. A faint red luminescence bled through the fabric. Valerian stopped dead in his tracks. His silver eyes widened, an expression of profound, earth-shattering shock breaking through his icy veneer. He stared at her glowing wrist, and then, incredibly, he looked up at Rebecca with a completely new expression. It was hunger, deep, ancient, and possessive. "Alistair," Valerian breathed, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. Alistair moved quickly to Valerian's side, following his master's gaze to Rebecca's arm. When the lawyer saw the glowing crest, all the color drained from his face, Alistair, the terrifying corporate fixer, immediately dropped to one knee on the linoleum floor, bowing his head. The two large men behind him instantly mirrored the motion. Rebecca backed against the door of the trauma bay, terrified. What is this? What did you do to me?" she demanded, pulling her sleeve up to reveal the glowing black and red crest. Valerian slowly closed the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in close. He smelled of pine needles, freezing rain, and something metallic like copper wire. "I did nothing to you, Miss Hayes," Valerian said softly, his eyes tracing the contours of her face, as if memorizing her. "My son did. He's a baby," Rebecca stammered. "He grabbed me, and this burn appeared." "It is not a burn," Valerian murmured, his voice softening into a dark velvet purr. "It is the ignis vinculum, the consort seal. For centuries, my bloodline has required a surrogate to tether our young to this world. Without a human anchor, someone with the exact 1 in a billion genetic resonance to sustain them, a pure-blood infant cannot regulate their core temperature. They freeze from the inside out." Rebecca shook her head, her mind violently rejecting the information. "That's insane. This is a hospital. You're talking about magic." "I am talking about biology, Rebecca," Valerian said, his use of her first name sending a shiver down her spine. "My enemies stole Noah to let him die in the snow. They knew he would freeze without a blood-bound guardian. But out of 8 billion humans on this planet, he found you. And by touching you, his biology fused with yours to save his own life." He reached out his long, pale fingers, gently taking her right hand. The moment his skin touched hers, the pain in her wrist vanished entirely, replaced by a rush of intoxicating, euphoric warmth. "You didn't just save my heir," Valerian whispered, his eyes locked onto hers, holding her completely captive. "By accepting his bond, you became his lifeline. His blood is tied to your heart. If you are separated from him by more than a mile, your heart will stop. If you die, he dies." He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Which means, Rebecca Hayes, you belong to the Croft estate now. Pack your things. We are going home." Rebecca stood frozen as Valerian stepped past her, opening the trauma bay doors to retrieve the child who had just rewritten her destiny. "I am not going anywhere with you," Rebecca stated, her voice shaking, but her jaw set. She backed away from the trauma bay, putting the heavy wooden door between herself and Valerian Croft. "You can take your son, Mr. Croft, but I am a nurse. I have a life here. You cannot legally kidnap me." Dr. Fisher finally found his voice, stepping forward with his phone drawn. "She's right. I'm calling the FBI. I don't care what papers your lawyers have. This is a hostage situation. Alistair Reed didn't even blink. He reached into his tailored charcoal suit and pulled out a sleek embossed business card, pressing it flat onto the triage counter. Dr. Fisher, that card contains the direct line to the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services. If you dial 911, I will dial that number. By morning, Telluride Regional Medical Center will lose all its federal funding. Your medical license will be revoked under the Patriot Act, and you will spend the rest of your life answering questions in a black site. Do not test the reach of the Croft Corporation. Fisher stared at the card, the blood draining from his face. Valerian ignored the exchange completely. He stepped out of the trauma bay, holding the infant against his chest. Wrapped in the velvet blanket, little Noah looked impossibly small against his father's massive frame. The baby's silver eyes immediately locked onto Rebecca, and a soft, trilling sound emerged from his lips. "It is not a kidnapping, Rebecca," Valerian said, his tone dangerously calm. "It is a biological necessity. I explained the parameters of the ignis vinculum. You said my heart would stop if I'm a mile away from him." Rebecca countered, her scientific mind aggressively rejecting the supernatural ultimatum. "That's a lie. It's a scare tactic to get me on a plane." Valerian's gaze hardened. The ambient temperature in the emergency room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. "I do not lie, Miss Hayes, but since your human logic requires empirical evidence, we will test your hypothesis." He turned on his heel, his dark cashmere coat flaring behind him, and walked toward the sliding glass doors. Alistair and the two massive guards immediately fell into step behind him. "Wait!" Rebecca yelled, but Valerian didn't stop. The doors parted, letting in a furious blast of the Colorado blizzard, and the men walked out into the swirling white abyss, taking the child with them. Rebecca stood frozen in the lobby. "He's bluffing," she thought, gripping the edge of the triage desk. "There is no invisible leash." 1 minute passed. The taillights of Valerian's blacked-out Cadillac Escalades disappeared down the access road toward Telluride Regional Airport. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. She looked at Dr. Fisher, who was still staring at the business card, paralyzed by fear. "See," Rebecca whispered, rubbing her marked wrist. "I'm fine. It was just The word died in her throat. It didn't start as pain. It started as a profound, terrifying emptiness, as if all the oxygen in the room had suddenly turned to ash. Rebecca gasped, her hands flying to her throat. The obsidian mark on her wrist flared not with the warm red luminescence from before, but with a sickening necrotic grey. Then the physical agony hit her. It felt like a massive, invisible fist had punched straight through her ribcage and clamped down on her myocardium. Rebecca collapsed onto the linoleum floor, her knees hitting the ground with a harsh crack. Her vision instantly tunneled the edges, bleeding into static. "Rebecca!" Sarah screamed, rushing around the desk and dropping to her knees. "Dr. Fisher! She's in V-fib! Get the crash cart!" Rebecca couldn't hear them. The roaring in her ears sounded like a jet engine. She was suffocating, her lungs frantically expanding, but finding no sustenance in the air. The bond, the tether. Valerian was pulling away, stretching the magical artery that kept her heart beating, and it was snapping. "I'm dying." Rebecca realized the sheer terror of it paralyzing her. He wasn't lying. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors shattered inward. Valerian moved faster than the human eye could track. 1 second he was outside in the storm. The next he was kneeling beside Rebecca on the shattered glass. He didn't have Noah with him. The baby was safely in the convoy. Valerian ripped his leather glove off and pressed his bare hand directly against Rebecca's chest, right over her seizing heart. A shockwave of pure liquid heat blasted through Rebecca's sternum. The crushing pressure vanished in a microsecond. Rebecca arched off the floor, taking a massive, desperate gulp of air. She coughed violently, curling into a ball as tears streamed down her face. "Shh!" Valerian commanded, his voice, a low, vibrating hum that commanded her body to obey. He effortlessly scooped her off the floor, holding her against his chest, as if she weighed nothing. He looked down at her, his silver eyes flashing with a terrifying mixture of fury and dark satisfaction. "Empirical evidence, Rebecca. Do you believe me now?" Rebecca could only nod, her face buried in the lapel of his coat. She was trembling uncontrollably, the residual shock of near death rattling her bones. "Bring her," Valerian ordered, striding out of the hospital without a backward glance. 10 minutes later, Rebecca found herself sitting in the back of an armored SUV speeding past the private security gates of Telluride Regional Airport. The storm was ferocious, but waiting on the icy tarmac was a massive Gulfstream G650ER, its engines already whining with immense power. The Croft Corporation logo, a subtle stylized crest of a dagger and moon, was painted in matte black on the tail fin. Rebecca had no luggage. She had no passport. She was wearing hospital scrubs and snow boots. But as the jet stairs descended and the dark, imposing figure of Valerian Croft gestured for her to board, Rebecca knew her old life was officially dead. She had no choice but to walk into the king's cage. The interior of the Gulfstream was a masterclass in aggressive, understated wealth. The cabin smelled of rich mahogany, expensive leather, and the faint, lingering scent of ozone. Rebecca sat on a plush, cream-colored divan swathed in an absurdly soft Loro Piana cashmere blanket Alistair had handed her upon boarding. In her arms, securely nestled against her chest, was Noah. The moment Rebecca had stepped onto the plane, the baby had begun to fuss, emitting a high-pitched, vibrating cry that sounded less like a human infant and more like a distressed falcon. Valerian had simply taken the child from a heavily armed nanny and placed him directly into Rebecca's lap. The second Noah's cheek pressed against Rebecca's collarbone, the crying ceased. The baby fell into a deep, silent sleep, his tiny hand firmly gripping the fabric of her scrubs. Rebecca stared out the reinforced oval window. They were cruising at 50,000 feet high, above the violent weather system ravaging the American West. The sky outside was a serene, bruised purple, giving way to the blackness of the stratosphere. "He feeds on your ambient kinetic energy," Valerian's voice broke the silence. Rebecca jumped, turning her head. Valerian was sitting in a high-backed leather captain's chair across the aisle. He had discarded his overcoat, revealing a tailored black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His skin was flawless pale and completely unmarred by the cold. He was nursing a crystal tumbler filled with a thick, dark red liquid that Rebecca, with mounting dread, knew was not wine. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, keeping her voice low to avoid waking the baby. "Energy, I thought vampires drank blood." Valerian offered a dark, humorless smile. I do, but a pure-blood infant cannot process biological matter for the first year of life. They require pure, unfiltered life force to fuse their immortal cells. Historically, our queens provided this, but Noah's mother was murdered before he was born. Rebecca felt a sharp pang of sympathy cutting through her terror. "Murdered by the Rousseau Syndicate?" Valerian said, his silver eyes darkening to the color of storm clouds. "A rival French bloodline. They believe my family has held the European throne for too long. They ambushed my wife's convoy in the Alps. They cut Noah from her womb, intending to let him freeze in the wilderness, erasing my heir and breaking my lineage." Rebecca shuddered, pulling the infant closer. "That's monstrous." "It is politics," Valerian corrected smoothly. "But they made a critical error. They underestimated the survival instinct of a Croft." Noah sensed a compatible biological anchor in the vicinity. "He reached out with his latent magic and he found you. The ignis vinculum is not something I can undo, Rebecca. Only Noah can release you, and he will not do so until his immortal transition is complete on his first birthday." "A year," Rebecca gasped. "I have to stay with you for a year. You have to stay alive for a year," Valerian corrected, leaning forward, the predatory grace of his movement making Rebecca's pulse spike. "The Rousseau family has spies everywhere. By tomorrow, the entire underworld will know that the King of the Night has found his son, and worse, they will know that the child's life is tethered to a fragile mortal human." He pointed a long, pale finger at her chest. "If they want to kill him, they no longer have to breach my security to reach his crib. They simply have to put a bullet in your head." The gravity of the situation finally crashed over Rebecca. She wasn't just a wet nurse. She was a living target. Suddenly, a searing wave of heat radiated from the mark on Rebecca's wrist. She hissed in pain instinctively, trying to pull her arm away, but Noah whimpered in his sleep, his grip tightening. "It burns!" Rebecca gasped, her breathing turning shallow. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The obsidian crest was glowing a fierce, angry crimson, the light illuminating the dim cabin. Her veins felt like they were filled with battery acid. Valerian set his glass down sharply. In a blur of motion, he crossed the aisle and knelt before her. "Your mortal physiology is rejecting the raw magic," he muttered, his tone shifting from regal to urgently clinical. "Your cellular structure cannot handle the output. He is drawing too much." "Make it stop," Rebecca whimpered, her vision blurring. As the pain escalated, it felt like she was being cooked from the inside out. "I have to vent the excess," Valerian commanded. "Give me your other hand. Do not pull away." Rebecca thrust her left hand out. Valerian caught it in his cool iron grip. He turned her palm upward, and without a second of hesitation pressed his lips to her pulse point. Rebecca gasped, arching back against the seat. It wasn't a bite, it was a draw. The moment Valerian's mouth touched her skin, the agonizing fire in her right wrist was violently yanked across her body. She could feel the volatile, burning magic being siphoned out of her bloodstream and drawn directly into Valerian. The intimacy of the act was overwhelming. A dizzying, euphoric rush of adrenaline flooded Rebecca's brain, completely overriding her fear. The scent of him, pine winter air, and dark musk filled her senses. She felt a deep, thrumming vibration radiating from his chest, a purr of absolute dominance that resonated in her own bones. After a long, breathless moment, Valerian pulled back. His silver eyes were completely blown out, the pupils swallowing the irises. A faint, glowing red mist dissipated from his lips as he exhaled. Rebecca collapsed against the cushions, panting heavily. The burning in her wrist was gone, replaced by a comfortable, steady warmth. Noah slept on, completely undisturbed. Valerian remained kneeling before her, his gaze locked on her flushed face. He reached out his thumb, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was impossibly tender for a man who had just threatened a hospital with federal ruin. "You are stronger than you look, Rebecca Hayes," Valerian murmured, his voice heavy with an emotion Rebecca couldn't read. "Captain speaking," a crisp British voice crackled over the cabin intercom, breaking the spell. "Mr. Croft, we have initiated our descent. We will be touching down at Geneva Airport Cointrin Terminal in 20 minutes. Security detail is waiting." Valerian stood up, smoothing his shirt. The terrifying king was back. He looked down at Rebecca and the sleeping air. "Welcome to your new life, Rebecca," Valerian said, turning toward the cockpit. "Keep him close. The war begins the moment we land." The heavy tires of the Gulfstream G650ER struck the rain-slicked tarmac of Geneva Airport's private Cointrin terminal with a violent jolt. Rebecca clutched Noah closer to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby merely stirred his tiny fingers, still impossibly strong, as they gripped the fabric of her scrub top. Through the reinforced oval window, Rebecca saw no standard airport personnel. Instead, the jet was instantly flanked by a tactical perimeter of 4 matte black Mercedes-Maybach armored SUVs and a dozen men wielding suppressed Heckler and Coke MP7s. "Stay behind me. Do not break my stride," Valerian commanded, his voice slicing through the hum of the descending engines. He had slipped his dark cashmere overcoat back on the very picture of lethal European royalty. As the cabin door hissed open, the biting chill of the Swiss winter flooded in. Alistair Reed went first, his hand resting casually inside his suit jacket. Valerian stepped out next, seamlessly pulling Rebecca and the baby against his side. His arm wrapped around her waist like an iron band, leaving no room for argument or hesitation. They moved down the stairs in a tight, impenetrable formation. Rebecca barely had time to register the blinding glare of the floodlights before she was shoved into the back of the lead Maybach. Valerian slid in beside her, the heavy armored door thudding shut with the finality of a vault. The convoy sped away from the airport, tearing through the rain-swept streets of Geneva. They crossed the Mont Blanc Bridge, the dark, churning waters of Lake Geneva, barely visible through the torrential downpour. They were heading toward Cologne, the ultra-exclusive municipality overlooking the lake, known for housing global billionaires, exiled diplomats, and apparently ancient vampire monarchs. "You have a small army," Rebecca murmured, watching the flashing city lights reflect in Valerian's silver eyes. "I have a security detail," Valerian corrected, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. "An army is what the Russo Syndicate will send when they pinpoint your exact location. Right now, they are blind. I intend to keep it that way." 20 minutes later, the convoy turned off the main stretch of Route d'Hermance, a massive 10-foot-high wrought-iron gate intricately woven with the Croft dagger and moon crest parted silently. They drove up a winding tree-lined driveway that seemed to stretch for miles before arriving at the estate. It was not a medieval castle, as Rebecca's exhausted mind had half expected. It was a breathtaking, hyper-modern fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone built directly into the cliffside. The estate seamlessly blended centuries-old European architectural dominance with state-of-the-art tactical defense. Before the vehicle even came to a complete stop, the front doors of the mansion opened. A striking woman in a crisp white lab coat over a tailored charcoal dress walked out to meet them. She had sharp cheekbones, severe dark hair pulled into a tight chignon, and the same terrifying bruised silver eyes as Valerian. Dr. Beatrice Armand, Valerian introduced her as he ushered Rebecca out of the vehicle and into the dry, cavernous foyer of the estate. My chief medical officer and head of biological security. Beatrice did not smile. She looked Rebecca up and down with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a rat. So this is the human anchor. She looks fragile, Valerian. Her resting heart rate is already elevated, and her capillary refill is sluggish. The transition magic is bleeding her dry. Which is why you are going to stabilize her, Beatrice. Valerian snapped his tone, brooking absolutely no dissent. She saved my son. You will ensure she survives the year. Beatrice gestured for Rebecca to follow her down a sweeping glass-paneled hallway that overlooked a high-tech underground laboratory. Rebecca, still clutching Noah, had no choice but to obey. Valerian shadowed them, his presence a heavy, oppressive weight in the room. Inside the medical bay, which looked more advanced than the surgical theaters at Telluride Regional, Beatrice instructed Rebecca to sit on an examination table. The doctor gently peeled back Rebecca's right sleeve. The obsidian mark, the ignis vinculum, had settled into a dull, pulsing red glow. Fascinating, Beatrice whispered, tracing a gloved finger just millimeters above Rebecca's skin. She looked up at Valerian. The resonance is perfectly synchronized, a 1 in a billion genetic mirror. But there is a complication, my king. Valerian crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Report. The boy's magic is aggressive. It requires a massive caloric and bioelectric draw to synthesize his immortal cells. Rebecca's human physiology cannot process the metabolic waste of the bond, Beatrice explained, tapping away at a holographic tablet. She looked directly at Rebecca. Your liver and kidneys will fail within 72 hours if the excess magic is not manually vented. Valerian did that on the plane. Rebecca blurted out, her cheeks heating at the memory of his mouth against her skin. He took the heat away. Beatrice's eyebrows shot up. She shot a highly inappropriate, deeply shocked look at Valerian, who stared back with murderous calm. I see, Beatrice said, clearing her throat. Well, that is one method, but it is a temporary fix. To keep Rebecca's organs from shutting down, you will have to draw the excess magical radiation from her bloodstream every 12 hours, every single day, for a year. Rebecca's stomach plummeted. Every 12 hours he has to. Yes, Valerian said softly, stepping closer to the examination table. His eyes locked onto Rebecca's, promising a terrifying, inescapable intimacy. You are bound to my son, Rebecca, but to survive it, you are bound to me. For the first 4 days, Rebecca existed in a state of suspended terror and exhaustive luxury. She was given a suite in the east wing of the estate that was larger than her entire apartment back in Colorado. The walls were lined with rare first-edition books, the floors were heated marble, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a staggering, unobstructed view of Lake Geneva and the snow-capped Alps. But it was a cage. The windows were bulletproof polycarbonate, the door locked from the outside with biometric seals, and she could not move more than 3,000 feet from Noah without her heart immediately seizing in her chest. Every 12 hours, like clockwork, Valerian entered her suite. The routine was silent, strictly adhered to, and completely agonizing in its intensity. Rebecca would sit on the edge of the plush velvet sofa. Valerian would kneel beside her, take her wrist, and press his lips to her pulse point. The violent burning buildup of the baby's magic would be viciously siphoned from her veins, replaced by an intoxicating rush of Valerian's own dark, icy energy. It left Rebecca breathless, flushed, and acutely aware of the terrifying power the Vampire King wielded. He never lingered and he rarely spoke, but the air crackled with heavy, unspoken tension long after he left the room. On the 5th night, the pristine illusion of safety shattered. Rebecca was in the suite's adjoining nursery, rocking Noah to sleep. The baby was growing at an alarming rate. He no longer felt like a fragile newborn. His gaze was far too sharp, tracking Rebecca's movements with predatory intelligence. A soft knock on the door startled her. Miss Hayes. It was one of the estate's domestic staff, a young human woman named Sophie, who usually brought Rebecca her meals. I have your dinner. "Come in," Rebecca called out softly, keeping her voice low. The heavy biometric door slid open. Sophie wheeled in a silver cart, the smell of roasted pheasant and truffles filling the room. But as Sophie turned around, Rebecca noticed something was wrong. The young woman's hands were shaking violently. Her eyes were glassy, her pupils dilated to the point where her irises were swallowed whole. "Sophie, are you all right?" Rebecca asked, stepping away from the bassinet. Sophie didn't answer. She reached beneath the starched white apron of her uniform. When her hand emerged, she was holding a customized, suppressed Glock 19. She raised the weapon, pointing the barrel directly at Rebecca's chest. "For the Rousseau bloodline," Sophie whispered in a monotonous, robotic voice. Mind compulsion, Rebecca realized with a spike of absolute horror. Rebecca dove violently to the left just as the weapon discharged with a muffled pft. The hollow point bullet shattered the antique porcelain vase that had been directly behind her head, sending jagged shards raining down onto the carpet. Rebecca hit the floor hard, scrambling backward toward the bassinet to shield Noah. Sophie advanced, her face completely devoid of emotion, and aimed the gun again. Before she could pull the trigger, the nursery window imploded. Despite the bulletproof glass, a force like a freight train smashed through the polycarbonate barrier. The shockwave knocked Rebecca flat. Amidst the rain of shattered glass and freezing Swiss air, Valerian materialized. He hadn't used the door. He had scaled the sheer cliff face and broken through a window designed to stop an anti-tank round. He moved with a brutality that defied comprehension. In a fraction of a second, Valerian had crossed the room. He didn't just disarm Sophie, he struck her wrist with the edge of his hand. The bone snapped with a sickening crack, the gun clattering to the floor. Valerian grabbed the maid by the throat, hoisting her completely off the ground. His eyes were not silver anymore. They were pitch black, completely consumed by an ancient, monstrous fury. Fangs, brilliant white and terrifyingly sharp, extended from his upper jaw. "Who gave you the command?" Valerian roared, the sound vibrating the very foundations of the room. Sophie choked, her face turning purple. The human must die. The tether." "Valerian, stop. She's mind-controlled. She's human," Rebecca screamed, pulling herself up from the floor. Valerian froze, his chest heaving. He looked at Rebecca, then at the terrified, brainwashed girl in his grip. With a snarl of disgust, he threw Sophie into the far wall. She crumpled to the floor, unconscious but breathing. The door to the suite burst open, Alistair and a dozen armed guards flooding into the room. "Secure the perimeter!" Alistair shouted, his usual calm completely evaporated. "Check the staff. Someone breached the psychic shielding of the estate." Valerian ignored them. He walked slowly toward Rebecca, his boots crunching on the broken glass. His fangs retracted, and the impenetrable blackness in his eyes faded back to stormy silver. But the lethal energy rolling off him was suffocating. He stopped inches from her. He reached out his hands, trembling slightly, and gripped her shoulders. His gaze swept over her face, checking for injuries before dropping to the bassinet to ensure Noah was unharmed. The baby was awake, watching his father with eerie calm. "They used a sleeper agent," Valerian said, his voice a dangerous razor-thin whisper. "Jean-Paul Rousseau. He found a weak link in my human staff. They bypassed my physical security with psychic compulsion. She almost killed me," Rebecca breathed, the delayed shock hitting her. Her knees buckled. Valerian caught her instantly, pulling her flush against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, an impenetrable shield of muscle and dark magic. "They will never get this close again," he swore, his jaw resting against the top of her head. "I underestimated their desperation. I will not make that mistake twice." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Pack whatever you need. You are no longer sleeping in the East Wing." Rebecca blinked, confusion cutting through her panic. "Where am I going?" "My chambers are located in the subterranean vault. It is lined with titanium and coated in psychic dampening wards. Nothing gets in or out without my blood signature," Valerian stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I can't share a room with you," Rebecca protested, her heart doing a dangerous stutter that had nothing to do with the magical tether. Valerian leaned down, his face mere inches from hers. The heat radiating from him was magnetic. "You will sleep in my bed, Rebecca. You will stay within my sight at all times. Because if the Rousseau Syndicate wants to cut my son's tether, They're going to have to tear my heart out to get to yours. Valerian's private sanctum was a subterranean masterpiece buried 300 feet beneath the Colony estate. It was a cavernous space carved directly into the bedrock, heavily fortified with walls of reinforced titanium and ancient inscribed runic stones that hummed with a low, imperceptible vibration. Despite its bunker-like purpose, it was draped in decadent luxury. Persian rugs muffled their footsteps. Dim, ambient lighting cast long, dancing shadows. And in the center of the room sat a massive four-poster bed draped in dark silk. Rebecca stood near the edge of the mattress, clutching Noah tightly against her chest. The baby was oblivious to the danger above his silver eyes, heavy with sleep. "Put him in the crib," Valerian said softly, gesturing to an ornate antique mahogany bassinet tucked into an alcove. "The psychic wards down here are impenetrable. He is completely safe." Rebecca hesitated, her heart still racing from the assassination attempt, but she gently laid the infant down. She turned to face Valerian. He had shed his ruined suit jacket and stood by a massive obsidian desk, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He handed one to her. "Drink. It is 50-year-old Macallan. You need it for the shock," he ordered, his tone devoid of its usual terrifying edge. It was almost gentle. Rebecca took a shaky sip, the liquid burning a warm path down her throat. She looked at the bed, then back to the Vampire King. "You're serious about this? About me sleeping here?" "I do not make empty threats. Rebecca and I do not take half measures with the things I protect," Valerian replied, setting his glass down. He stepped into her personal space, the sheer physical gravity of his presence making her breath hitch. "You are the ignis vinculum. You carry the lifeblood of my lineage. But beyond that," he paused, his silver eyes tracing the curve of her neck, "I will not let them take you. Not for the boy, for me." Rebecca's pulse spiked. It wasn't the magical tether causing her heart to race. It was the raw, unmasked hunger in his expression. The terrifying monarch of the European underworld was looking at a human nurse, as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Before Rebecca could respond, a sharp, searing pain erupted on her right wrist. The 12-hour cycle. The obsidian crest flared violently, bleeding a harsh, crimson light into the dim room. She gasped, the glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the rug. "The cycle is accelerating," Valerian muttered, catching her waist before her knees buckled. "The adrenaline in your system from the attack is making Noah's magic volatile." He didn't wait for her to sit. He backed her gently against the heavy oak post of the bed, pinning her there with his body. He lifted her right arm, exposing the glowing mark. But this time he didn't just press his lips to the pulse point on her wrist. He pushed her sleeve higher, his mouth trailing up the sensitive skin of her inner forearm, drawing the toxic, burning magic out in slow, agonizingly pleasurable pulls. Rebecca threw her head back against the wood, a breathless sound escaping her lips. The pain vanished instantly, replaced by a rush of dark, euphoric energy that short-circuited her brain. Valerian's hands gripped her hips, anchoring her as he drew the magic into his own body. He moved higher, his lips grazing the crook of her elbow, then her shoulder, until his mouth was agonizingly close to her neck. "Valerian," she whispered, her hands instinctively coming up to bury themselves in his thick dark hair. He froze, his chest heaving against hers. His eyes were entirely black, the fangs elongated, hovering mere millimeters from her jugular. He was fighting centuries of predatory instinct, battling the urge to consume her entirely. Slowly, agonizingly, he pulled back, his breathing ragged. "You test my restraint, Rebecca Hayes," he murmured, resting his forehead against hers. "And my restraint is famously poor." Suddenly, a blaring, digitized siren ripped through the vault. The ambient lights flashed a harsh, violent red. Valerian's head snapped up, the vulnerability in his face instantly replaced by the cold, lethal mask of a warlord. A holographic comms panel flared to life on the obsidian desk. Alistair Reed's face appeared smeared with blood and ash. "My king," Alistair shouted over the deafening sound of automatic gunfire. "It's a full-scale siege. Jean-Paul Rousseau is leading them personally. They breached the outer gate with C4. They have UV incendiaries. We are holding the main foyer, but they brought a tactical strike team. Hold the choke point. Do not let them reach the subterranean elevator," Valerian barked. He turned to Rebecca, his expression grim. "The vault is sealed. It will withstand a bunker buster missile. Do not open this door for anyone but me. You're going up there? Rebecca asked, gripping his forearm. Valerian, if they have an army, I am the king of the night. Valerian interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying guttural octave. They are about to remember why. He pressed a hard, bruising kiss to her mouth, a promise and a claim, before turning and striding out the heavy vault door. The titanium slabs hissed shut the locking mechanisms, engaging with a series of heavy metallic thuds. Rebecca was alone in the silence. 10 minutes passed. The muffled vibrations of explosives shook the ceiling above, sending dust drifting down from the stone rafters. Rebecca paced the length of the room, checking Noah every 30 seconds. The baby was miraculously still asleep. Then the comms panel on the desk chimed. The screen flickered, bypassing the external security lock. The heavy titanium doors didn't open, but a secondary hidden pneumatic door, one Rebecca hadn't even noticed, blended perfectly into the stone wall, slid open with a quiet hiss. Dr. Beatrice Armour stepped into the vault. Rebecca froze. Beatrice was dressed in a sleek, tactical suit, holding a silver medical briefcase. Her usually pristine hair was slightly disheveled, but her silver eyes were calm, calculating, and entirely devoid of the panic one would expect during a siege. Dr. Armand, how did you get in here? Valerian locked the vault, Rebecca said, stepping instinctively between the doctor and the bassinet. Valerian locked the main entrance, Beatrice corrected smoothly, walking toward the obsidian desk and setting the briefcase down. But as the chief medical officer, I hold the emergency bio-overrides for the medical evacuation tunnels, just in case the king is ever critically wounded. Beatrice popped the latches on the briefcase. Inside was a single heavy glass syringe filled with a viscous, glowing silver fluid. Rebecca's medical training screamed at her. What is that? A necessary correction, Beatrice said, picking up the syringe and flicking the needle. Jean-Paul Rousseau's attack is merely a distraction, a loud, messy diversion to draw Valerian up to the surface so I could come down here. Rebecca's blood ran cold. You're working for the Syndicate. I work for the preservation of the Croft bloodline. Beatrice snapped her stoic facade, cracking with sudden venomous disgust. Valerian has lost his mind. He is allowing our royal heir to be tethered to a mortal, a fragile, disease-prone, fleeting human. You are an infection on our lineage, Rebecca. The ignis vinculum is supposed to be a sacred bond between pure bloods, not a parasite feeding on a mudblood nurse. If you kill me, Noah dies, Rebecca warned, her hands balling into fists. She scanned the room for a weapon. A heavy brass fire poker rested near the unlit hearth 10 feet away. That was true 5 days ago, Beatrice said, taking a step toward her. But this syringe contains synthetic vampire venom, synthesized with Jean-Paul's own royal blood. If I inject this directly into your heart, it will violently sever the tether. It will kill you instantly, yes. But the shock wave will jumpstart Noah's immortal transition early. He will survive, and he will be pure. Stay away from me, Rebecca warned, slowly backing toward the fireplace. It will be quick, Beatrice sneered. She moved with supernatural speed, closing the distance in a blur. But Rebecca was a trauma nurse who had survived double shifts in the ER. Her reflexes were sharp. As Beatrice lunged, Rebecca dove toward the hearth, grabbing the heavy brass fire poker. She swung it with all her might, striking Beatrice directly across the jaw. The blow would have shattered a human skull. Beatrice merely staggered back, a hiss of pure fury escaping her lips. The doctor's fangs descended, her eyes turning pitch black. Insolent mortal, Beatrice spat, wiping a drop of dark blood from her lip. She lunged again, grabbing Rebecca by the throat and slamming her against the stone wall. The fire poker clattered to the floor. Rebecca gasped for air, her feet dangling off the ground. Beatrice raised the silver syringe, aiming it directly at Rebecca's chest. No, Rebecca thought, panic and primal fury exploding in her chest. I will not let you hurt him. I will not die here. As the needle descended, the ignis vinculum on Rebecca's wrist reacted to her sheer will to survive. It didn't just glow red. It erupted into blinding, searing white light. The tether, deeply connected to Valerian's power and Noah's latent magic, surged backward, pouring raw, unfiltered kinetic energy directly into Rebecca's veins. Rebecca's eyes flared with a terrifying, unnatural luminescence. With a roar of borrowed strength, she brought her hand up and gripped Beatrice's wrist. The doctor's eyes widened in shock as the human nurse halted the supernatural strike with impossible force. The white-hot magic transferred from Rebecca's skin to Beatrice's arm, burning through her tactical suit and searing her flesh. Beatrice screamed, dropping the syringe and stumbling backward, clutching her smoking wrist. Before Beatrice could recover, the main titanium vault doors were blown completely off their hinges. The massive slabs of metal crashed into the room with deafening force, burying themselves into the stone floor. Standing in the doorway, drenched in the blood of his enemies, was Valerian. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He saw the syringe on the floor. He saw the burn on Beatrice's wrist. He saw Rebecca gasping against the wall, her mark glowing like a dying star. Valerian moved. It wasn't a run, it was a teleportation of sheer, unadulterated violence. He crossed the vault and grabbed Beatrice by the throat, hoisting the traitorous doctor into the air. "My king, please!" Beatrice choked out, her fangs retracting in absolute terror. "The bloodline! She is my queen," Valerian roared. With a sickening twist of his arm, he snapped Beatrice's neck, the loud crack echoing off the stone walls. He dropped her lifeless body to the floor like discarded trash. The vault was dead silent, save for the crackling of the broken electronics at the door. Valerian turned to Rebecca. He was a terrifying sight, his coat torn, his face smeared with ash, and the dark blood of the syndicate soldiers. But as he looked at her, his eyes softened, the monstrous rage evaporating. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. Rebecca buried her face in his neck, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her shaking violently. "It's over," Valerian whispered fiercely into her hair. "Jean-Paul is dead. His soldiers are ash. You are safe. Noah is safe." He pulled back his blood-stained hands, gently cupping her face. He looked at the glowing mark on her wrist, then deep into her eyes. "You pulled on the magic. You fought back. A mortal should not have been able to do that without their heart exploding." "I'm not just a mortal anymore, am I?" Rebecca asked, her breathing steadying. "No," Valerian said softly, a look of profound awe crossing his aristocratic features. "The tether didn't just bind you to my son, it bound my soul to yours. You are the heart of this house now, Rebecca. You rule by my side, or I do not rule at all." He leaned down and kissed her deeply and completely, sealing the promise. Rebecca kissed him back, the cold of the underground vault melting away beneath the burning heat of the ignis vinculum. She had found a baby in the snow to save a life, and in doing so she had found her kingdom. Rebecca thought her life was saving premature infants in a quiet Colorado hospital. Instead, she became the undisputed queen of the European underworld, bound by blood magic and fierce love to the most dangerous man on earth. Her journey from terrified hostage to a sovereign who commands the very magic of the Vampire King proves that true strength isn't determined by immortality, but by the will to protect those you love. If you love this epic dark romance, smash that like button, share this story and subscribe for more thrilling supernatural sagas.